tarde. Can you hear me?
Yes. Thank you, Mário, for joining.
Obrigado.
So I'm going to start recording. Thank you, everybody, to joining us to this event today, building immigration policy.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Thank you, Mário, for joining.
Obrigado.
Thank you for joining. Welcome, everybody. Thank you, everybody, to joining us to this event today, building immigration policy.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Thank you, Mário, for joining.
Obrigado.
And I would like to thank you, sorry, with the technical problems, I'd like to thank you, everybody, and welcome you to this event, Building Migration Policy. I would like to thank our special guests for joining us today, Katerina Linos, and in fact, I would like to also thank the co-sponsors of these events, the BIMI, the Berkeley Interdisciplinary Migration Initiative, and also the Consul General of Portugal that is with us today. And I would like to give him the room for some words on the issue.
Thank you very much, Duarte, and also thank you, first of all, to Professor Katerina Linos for your availability and to moderate this talk, and in particular to thank Professor Katerina Linos and my friend and colleague Mário Pedro from Brussels for speaking at this talk. The purpose of this series is to contribute to put on Berkeley's agenda some of the main EU topics in a way that we can help bridge Europe and California. Migration, it's obviously a key subject, both in Europe and in the US, in particular in California. It was an issue very important for the Portuguese presidency of the European Union. Mário Pedro had a very much hands-on approach and responsibility on this issue. I underline, for example, the blue card process, which foresees management of legal migration for highly qualified workers. And it was very much his work that allowed us to achieve this. I also note that Frédéric Jung, the Consul General of France, is attending. He will be the incoming presidency from January 1st onwards, and certainly this is an issue to which France and the European Union in general attaches the utmost importance. So basically, this is what I wanted to say to you. Thank you very much from you.
Thank you, Consul General. I will be now presenting our guests, besides, of course, the Associate Director of IES, Katerina Linos. We have with us today Mário Pedro, who is graduated in law from the University of Lisbon, developed a career in the legal office of that Portuguese Immigration Service between 1999 and 2009, first as a lawyer and later as head of the Department of Operations. Between January 2010 and October 2018, he worked as a lawyer at the European Agency for Border and Coast Guard, Frontex, and later on in the Legal and Human Rights Office of the Mission of the European Union External Action Service in Kosovo. In February 2019, was appointed advisor at the Permanent Representation of Portugal to the European Union, REPER, for the areas of asylum and migration, and currently is the coordinator of Justice and Home Affairs of the Permanent Representation. Throughout this year, participated as an expert in various committees of the European Commission and in working groups of the Council of the European Union in the area of migration and asylum. He was a speaker at several seminars and academia in Portugal and in multiple countries in the context of functions he performed. Thank you so much, Dr. Mário Pedro, for joining us, for your availability. And now Katerina Linos, who is a professor at law school. Research and teaching interests include international law, comparative law, European Union law, employment law, and migration law. Her work basically combines legal analysis and with empirical method. She's the Linos of the Democratic Foundations of Policy Diffusion, Our Health, Family, and Employment Laws countries, explains the politics of legal transportation. She's the author of several research papers, and she has been awarded with many awards, the 2014 Peter Kazenstein's Award, the Giovanni Sartori Prize as the best book on qualitative methods, and she was reviewed by 9, and I was reviewed this book by 9 international law professors for Opinio Juris Symposium. The law and politics of the European Union are together a key area of Linos' research, and she's going to talk about this today. Linos' research appears in leading law reviews and peer-reviewed journals, including the American Journal of International Law, the American Journal of Political Science, the American Political Science Review, California Law Review, Chicago Law Review, Comparative Political Studies, the European Sociological Review, and organization. She holds a GD and a PhD from Harvard and was a junior fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows. Thank you, Professor Katerina Linos, for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you all in this event, and I'll pass the word to Akasemi Newsom.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I'll be quite brief. I merely want to echo my colleague Duarte in thanking you all for joining us, thanking our speakers, and thanking the Consul General of Portugal for his support and the Berkeley International Migration Initiative for their support and co-sponsorship. Let's dive right into the discussion, and Katerina, the floor is yours to kick off with your presentation.
Thank you so much, Duarte and Akasemi, for the generous introduction and invitation. I'm particularly delighted to be here, not only because questions of cooperation with the EU and comparison are always relevant, but because in my own empirical research, I found that Portugal's generosity towards refugees in the Syrian crisis in particular is not widely known and recognized, and I'm just delighted to be able to speak on that in particular. Let me share some slides with you. Let me just check that I can share my screen so that I can make everything a little bit clearer. Is my screen visible? Perfect. So I'll be presenting some joint work. I work with a lot of people. This particular paper is with Elena Chachko, who's at Harvard and Berkeley Law. And what I will be discussing is, when is it the case that we are sharing responsibility for refugees, and when are we instead dumping that responsibility? In international law, the central pillar of the refugee framework is the principle of non-refoulement. The idea that once a refugee reaches your border, you cannot turn them back to danger. However, this principle in effect means that 9 out of 10 refugees are hosted in developing countries, and that the vast majority of financial and physical obligations to refugees fall on countries that are close to the conflict, but not rich or particularly stable. And we have seen some efforts at the global, regional level to share responsibility more actively. In the EU, it's the solidarity principle that is most ambitious. And what I want to talk about is how we move from the duty to the individual refugee, which is very well established, to duties to states that host a lot of refugees. What Elena and I have done is made a very simple classification model. What do we consider a progressive scheme? What do we consider a regressive scheme? A regressive scheme is one which transfers responsibility to countries where refugees are unlikely to be protected, that lack the resources or the will to be protected. And unfortunately, especially under the Trump administration, we saw several regressive schemes as well as progressive ones. The core idea in refugee law is physically hosting refugees. But in addition, there can be very significant financial contributions that wealthy states can put into the mix. This is because the cost of hosting a refugee in a developing state is about 10 times lower than hosting a refugee in a rich country, and because many refugees themselves prefer to be hosted in countries in which they speak the language and have cultural connection. In addition, we find that progressive regimes are those that involve many countries rather than those determined solely by bilateral agreements. And bilateral agreements, the stronger party can often coerce the weaker party. And finally, Elena and I think that binding agreements with institutional force can be more solid over time as administrations change and as crises emerge. Let me be a little bit more concrete. At the United Nations, there has been a lot of activity on migrants and refugees, the 2 global compacts, annual meetings. We call it passing the collective collection plate, good in spirit, but at the end of the day, if you're only asking for volunteers, there is not going to be a lot of money or a lot of hosting commitments. At the same time, this is a global effort that brings attention to these issues, so it's well worth emphasizing the positive here. US efforts have varied very dramatically. It used to be the case that the US, prior to the Trump administration, prior to the pandemic, was the #1 country in refugee resettlement. What that meant was that in addition to people who came to the southern border and applied for protection, the US actively worked with UNHCR to move people from a variety of African camps to the United States and offer them a path to citizenship. And the numbers of people was in 100,000, 200,000 in peak years, including under President Obama, but also under President Reagan. This was a bipartisan effort until recently. Also notable what have been US efforts to resettle large numbers of refugees from countries where the US was involved in military operations. So resettlement from Indochina in the 1970s, resettlement from Iraq in the early 2000s, and resettlements from Afghanistan more recently. Many of the people who obtain visas under these programs are not technically refugees. They have other specialized programs, but again, these are efforts where the US has been a global leader. That said, under the Trump administration, we also had the clearest examples of refugee dumping agreements. And unfortunately, some of this is continuing under the Biden administration. There are agreements with Guatemala, Nicaragua, and Honduras to turn away people who apply for asylum to the US and to place these people in countries that not only have their own crises in terms of refugees fleeing gang violence, but have no effective asylum system in place. So these are likely in violation of our international legal commitments not to turn away refugees to danger. Under the Biden administration, we have seen people welcomed from Afghanistan, but we have seen large numbers of Haitians turned away at the southern border. And in particular, public health policies being used to put in danger kind of a core principle of the refugee regime, which is that everyone should be entitled to apply for asylum. Let me turn to the EU and compare some of the emergency measures that were put in 2015 Council decisions and are partially reiterated in the new Pact, and compare that to the EU-Turkey deal. What was impressive in my view is that the Council decided on the recommendation of the Commission to help countries that had received a disproportionate number of asylum applications, notably Greece and Italy, to have a number of those applicants for asylum have their claims processed in other European states. This model was very close to what political theorists dream of, in that the factors here were not political bargaining, but it was a formula based effectively on capacity to host. Some of these ideas were challenged before the European Court of Justice by xenophobic governments, such as those of Hungary. This has been very controversial politically, but we still see both that this happened to some extent in the Syrian crisis, and that the reform of the Dublin rules again calls for some concrete illustrations of solidarity. At the same time, the EU-Turkey deal has been widely criticized, primarily for not allowing a number of refugees to apply for protection in Europe and to remain in Turkey, a state that already has at least 3.6 million refugees. What Elena and I want to emphasize is that with this deal, there was a 6 billion payment to Erdogan, which is very significant. This amount of money is close. It depends on how you calculate the cost per refugee, but it is one of the more generous offers internationally. And the president of Colombia recently made a really apt point. So he said, we are really glad to be taking in hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans, but we are getting in international aid about 1/10 of what Turkey was offered. So this is kind of just indicative that although this deal can be widely criticized, the financial contribution of the Europeans was sizable. Let me turn to a different project to speak briefly about Portugal before I conclude. With a large team of undergrads and grads, what we thought to do is to look at how refugees themselves saw this crisis. So what we did was we scraped all of the Facebook posts on sites devoted to refugee issues and worked with an NGO that interviewed refugees at hotspots and other first sites to see how they viewed their journey, their views about Europe, their thoughts. All of this is available on digitalrefuge.berkeley.edu. It's an interactive site. It is very, very cool. But here I just have a static map to foreground Portugal. The background colors are based on MIPEC scores, and they reflect an overall assessment based on over 100 indicators of how generous a country is towards refugees. Countries in blue are the most generous, countries in green less so, orange less so, and red least friendly. And among the countries in blue, we see Scandinavia, but we also see Portugal. What my team and I overlaid on these MIPEC scores are sizes of kind of how much were these countries talked about in refugee communities. Did refugees talk about traveling to particular destinations that were friendly or hostile? And what we found out was that refugees had a very limited map of Europe in their mind. They knew about Turkey and some of the problems associated with that. They knew about Greece. They also had dreams of traveling to Sweden and to Germany. But Portugal has a really small gray circle. Nobody knew that Portugal too was welcoming refugees, that the Portuguese government, unlike the Hungarian government, unlike many other governments, said, look, we have 10,000 spaces for refugees and they're not being filled up. That mismatch, that effort and that generosity on the part of Portugal is something I wanted to foreground. Let me conclude to say that the refugee policy is governed both by this principle of not turning back refugees to danger, which tends to leave a lot of refugees in the developing world, and with ad hoc voluntary commitments. Angela Merkel's idea that 1 million refugees from Syria would not be turned back, the US policy towards Afghanistan, all of this is nice. But in addition to these one-off ad hoc commitments, binding multilateral plans have been implemented in the past. They were implemented after the Vietnam conflict. They were implemented in part in the Syrian crisis. And I think they are very useful. In contrast, a core principle of the Dublin regime, the Dublin III regime that was imitated by the Trump administration, the first safe country arrangement is presumptively regressive. We saw this in the Trump administration when the requirement that people traveling through Central America and through Mexico apply first to some other country and only be able to apply to the US if they had been turned away was put in practice. And basically that meant that nobody would be able to apply for asylum in the US anymore, and everyone would have to be protected in a country that was much poorer than the US. The final point I want to make is that sometimes xenophobia and backlash and just the cost of hosting refugees means that the countries in the rich world are unlikely to increase their hosting commitments. That said, in those circumstances, I think significant financial contributions, such as those that were part of the EU-Turkey deal, such as the penalties that the EU had put in place for countries not willing to take in refugees, are a good second best solution and worth spreading. Let me end here. I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Katerina, for that very engaging and interesting presentation. I have many questions that I would like to discuss with you, but I think first we will turn to the presentation by Dr. Mário Pedro. Mario, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me. Perfect. Thank you. Thanks a lot. So also from my side, I will start to salute all the participants, and also would like to thank the organizers for honoring me with this invitation to share with you what has been my experience, as you noticed from the presentation kindly made by Duarte, my latest experience here at the Portuguese Permanent Representation at the EU, dealing with migration and the asylum files since 2019, and how I had the opportunity to follow how the attempts of the European Union to build a migration policy. Migration has been for many years in the agenda of the EU. I remember taking part in some meetings regarding legal migration back in 2001, so it's been a long time. But of course, since 2015 and the migration crisis, it really hit the top of the political agenda. Back in 2015, what we could assist was an attempt from the EU as a whole to have a first comprehensive approach to deal with migration and resulting from the crisis of 2015. And was presented an European migration, EU agenda for migration. It consisted in a set of proposals that were supposed to provide or to give the European Union a set of solutions to deal what was going on at the borders and within the territory. The main pillars of this agenda, or the policies that were presented, were mostly a reinforced border management, combating migrant smuggling and trafficking of persons, adopting a common European asylum system, and enhancing legal and safe pathways to the EU. All of this according to the two main principles ruling the migration policy, which are the principle of solidarity among member states and the principle of responsibility of each member state. As you know, or I don't know how familiar you are with the legislative procedure of the EU, but it's quite complex. I will just briefly mention it. So the proposals set forth by the Commission back in 2015 started to be discussed, and in order to reach an agreement, the Commission proposal has to have an agreement on one side within the Council. I mean the 27 member states. And there is a need for qualified majority over certain proposals in order to go to the second stage, which is the interinstitutional negotiations with the European Parliament, which is the co-legislator. So what happened with these proposals back in 2015? Not much. I think they are all stalled when I arrived in Brussels. So in 2019, there was not much going on. Meetings were more and more rare. And this was felt throughout the institutions. And obviously the Commission had to react. We also had the opportunity to have a new European Commission appointed and a new European Parliament elected in 2019. So in 2020, in September 2020, the Commission made or reinvented itself and presented what is known as the Pact for Migration and Asylum. It stands as a comprehensive approach for the migration phenomenon, and dealing with both sides, the internal dimension, the external dimension of the migration. On the internal dimension, it aims at having, it tackles border management, asylum, and legal migration. And at the external dimension, it addresses the relationships of the EU with the neighboring countries. So this was late 2020, so September 2020. Already within COVID times and pandemic situation, not facilitating the discussions. And for this reason, and not only for the reason, we are now 1 year later. Where are we? It's now what I wanted to address. So at the internal dimension, the purpose of having a renewed asylum policy has not been successful so far. All the proposals are stalled. And what we have been seeing so far is that member states have different policies regarding how they approach the principle of solidarity. They have different perceptions on how this principle should be implemented. On the other hand, the proposals tackling the border security, or one proposal tackling the border security, it's also stalled because also there are different views of the member state within the member states regarding the principle of responsibility. So in the internal dimension, the only case that we can say that has moved so far was, as our council just mentioned, the Blue Card Directive, which is a legal instrument providing the conditions for entry and residence of the highly qualified workers. I was directly involved in the discussions of this directive. Let me just recall that this proposal was already presented in 2016 within the EU Agenda for Migration, but the discussions were stopped back in 2017, if I'm not mistaken, because there were strong divisions of opinions on whether the member states were allowed or not to keep their own national schemes regarding the same subject. Only with a new commission and a new parliament we could move on, ensuring, or the council had ensured that the level of protection and rights ensured to the third country nationals will be exactly the same. So there will be a level playing field between the EU scheme and the national scheme. And this is 1 year later, the only achievement that we were able to have, apart from also a renewed agency supporting the member states implementing the asylum policies, meaning what is called now the EASO will turn into a fully fledged agency, the European Union Agency for Asylum, which was also a result of the Portuguese presidency. On the external dimension, here it is, we have more concrete results. during the Portuguese presidency, promoted joint discussions together with the Ministries for Internal Affairs and the Ministers of Foreign Affairs, which were quite fruitful. And by the end of our presidency, there were concrete instructions sent out to the Commission saying, okay, let's start developing these tailor-made partnerships with third countries. Talking about balanced, comprehensive, and tailor-made. What does this mean? It means that we want to tackle all the different perspectives of the migration, not only border management, capacity building, readmission, of course, and also legal pathways. Balanced in the sense that it must be a win-win situation, must be a good partnership for both the EU and the third country involved. And finally, tailor-made, because each third country has its own needs and its own specificities, and they should be taken into account. And it is within this external dimension where so far the migration policy has seen some more concrete results. We still have high hopes for the incoming presidency that we can break this impasse where we are falling again, and that we can move on. I think I will stop now, but I will be very glad to answer all your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pedro Mario, for that very interesting and up-to-date presentation. I've got so many questions. I think the first topic I would like both of you to address in some detail has to do with a critique you get from people and politicians who are concerned about the increase in refugee and asylum seekers, and the critique made that they're not real refugees, but that they are fleeing economic distress or just searching to improve their economic status. To Mario, I would say, does the new Pact on Migration and Asylum that we see from the EU, this transformation from EASO to a fully fledged agency of asylum, does this include expanded legal paths for economic migrants, for migrants to simply enter the EU and not have to, claim political persecution? And then to Katerina, a sort of slightly tweaked version of the same question. In your research, your comparative research on sort of refugee resettlement in the US and the EU, have you seen parallel or related changes to legal paths of migration for those coming for reasons of family reunification or seeking greater economic opportunities, or quite frankly, because the economic situation in their home countries is so dire that they, cannot survive unless they migrate? So my question to both of you is really about how legal paths to migration, including for economic reasons, have been integrated into refugee and asylum policy in both the US and the EU. So your thoughts on that? Perhaps Mario, since I addressed you first, you could go, and then we'll let Katerina say something.
Thank you for a question. I would say yes, there is it is foreseen in the Pact the enhancement of these legal pathways. We, as presidency, we promoted 2 meetings at least in order to assess the willingness of member states to have new legal acts ruling or governing the entry and residence of migrants for economic reasons, we addressed already, and we have been addressed the legal migration in, let's put it this way, clusters. So we have rules for intercorporate transferees. We have seasonal workers, researchers, no directive, no regulation applying to medium or low skills. During these meetings that we promoted, we noticed that there was the appetite for having such issues ruled at EU level was not very strong, to say the least. Nevertheless, and because not everything has to be a law, I know, and we are expecting in December the presentation of what the Commission is called the talent pool. Don't be misled by the word talent. It has nothing to do with highly skilled workers. This is already covered by the Blue Card Directive. It's an attempt to, I'm sorry, to set up instruments and the necessary instruments to have some sort of a match between demands and offer of jobs in the EU. I don't know, it's still it's still in the secret of the Commission, but I know that this is something new that will be presented in December. That will obviously be open to the member states that are willing to participate and to join this initiative, and to facilitate the hiring of third country nationals that are in their countries of origin. And I think it stands as one good step forward, provided that we already know that from the legal point of view, the member states are keen on keeping their own competence ruling this issue.
Thank you so much. Professor Linos, Katerina?
Let me just echo some of these ideas. From the beginning of the refugee law regime, there was this really sharp distinction between political persecution, where people deserve protection, and economic migrants, where their home state was supposed to provide for better living conditions, and there was no right to migration. We relied very heavily on exit controls in the period of the Cold War. We could not have taken in all the political refugees had China or the Soviet Union not been preventing them from exiting. Since the Cold War, and more recently, some of the forms that were mentioned have expanded a bit. So in Europe, we saw subsidiary protection. So the definition of a political refugee not being limited to someone who was directly targeted for their beliefs, but to Syrians fleeing a civil war in general. We saw a lot of temporary visas in the US, people from particular countries that had suffered natural disasters not being returned. And of course, special programs where the economic conditions in Europe or in the US or in other host states really match. So for highly skilled workers, for agricultural workers. One item that wasn't mentioned that is again ad hoc but significant are regularization. So the US had the last big regularization in the 80s. Portugal and the rest of Southern Europe had important regularizations in the 90s. The US, the Dreamers program can be seen as such a regularization. So these two can be quite significant. Here, the big legal shift is in the Americas. So under the Cartagena Pact, there has been a bigger, broader understanding of what it is to be a refugee, more movement towards what Akasemi was saying to suggest that the two are connected. Some large regularizations of Venezuelan migrants were basically fleeing a collapsed state, recognized as refugees or as deserving of protection and ultimately citizenship. Finally, there was a question in the chat about climate change. My short answer to this is that legally, there seems to be a very big difference between people fleeing states like Bangladesh that are still going to survive as states, but whose economies are going to be dramatically damaged, and people fleeing states, small island states that might be completely uninhabitable. There we have a traditional regime concerning stateless persons, so that if your state is completely unable to protect you in any way, literally, there that is more straightforward as a legal matter.
Thank you so much, Katerina and Mario. And just to, if I can follow up a bit on the audience question on climate change, to expand it a bit, I see very much the news coverage on climate change as in some ways a critique on the ways in which migration policy seems to be reactive as opposed to proactive and anticipatory. But perhaps I'm wrong. In your view, Mario, does the new pact on migration contain proactive elements, anticipatory elements, in that the EU is anticipating even greater numbers of migrants and refugees owing to climate change? Is this something you see in the US context, Katerina? So perhaps Mario, you could address that first, or either is ready.
Yes, Professor, thank you. Yeah, I would say yes. I would say that exactly this this novelty regarding the external dimension and of the pact, and how easy it was to have consensus regarding the need to work together with the countries of origin and countries of transit, knowing that some of them will be affected by these climate changes in the near future. I think it's a sign that the EU is quite aware of what will probably happen in the future, and it's already acting on the preventive way. And let me a little bit stress, as I said before, it's not just a question. We're not talking about readmission agreements. It's not what we're talking about. These exist, they are independent. We're talking about totally comprehensive and very well supported financially set of programs targeting the needs of each of our neighbors, neighbor said countries. And I think in this regard, I think it is already a way of preventing, of at least managing migration. You know that the discussion or the perspectives are different within the member states. Some look at migration from the security point of view. Others have different perspectives and pay attention to the decline of the population, to the needs of the labor market. And I know that in this regard, knowing that it's also for the benefit of the EU to have, and its member states to have migrants, that they are needed. It's one of the strong points of these partnerships that are being built with the third countries is the illegal migration.
Yes, I think, as was emphasized, the only way to ensure that less migration happens, which is in the interests of refugees and migrants themselves. Nobody sees fleeing their home country as a refugee as a first best option. Lots of people would prefer to have opportunities to stay closer to home but lack them, is very significant financial aid. I think there is some of that. There's a little bit of a question as to what this aid is targeted towards. Some of it is clearly given in the form of grants and loan forgiveness to countries that are hosting a lot of refugees or to improve economic development. Other agreements have more complicated dimensions. So to me, the EU deals with Libya in particular are very disturbing. So giving money to a state that has collapsed to prevent migrants from leaving is very different from giving money to a state like Turkey that has all kinds of problems, but where effectively, refugees have opportunities to live reasonable livelihoods.
Thank you, Katerina. Thank you, Mario. What impact has the coronavirus epidemic or pandemic, we're moving, I guess, into the epidemic phase, had on migration and refugee policy in the EU? the US. Do you see opportunities for more progressive approaches to refugee policy, or do you see greater obstacles to it? And I want to highlight a sort of not well-known sort of policy achievement on the part of Portugal, which is the coronavirus pandemic regularization of undocumented migrants in Portugal as a response to the pandemic, and in an effort to increase national public health, which I think was quite unique, because around the world we saw borders closing to migrants and refugees. So what opportunities, what challenges did this public health crisis cause for migration policy, in your view? Perhaps, Katerina, do you want to start first, since you
yes
already?
Although I'd love to hear more about the Portuguese example, because Portugal is doing so well both on COVID and relative to other EU states on xenophobic policies. So the immediate consequence was border closures, which was disturbing to everyone. It's annoying not to be able to see your family, but is life-threatening to people fleeing persecution. So these border closures were put in place at the beginning of the pandemic. And unfortunately, some of the measures are being continued under the Biden administration, even though populations have access to vaccine and other less restrictive policies are possible. Another big issue the pandemic brought to light was that refugees are often hosted in camps. There's no reason why this should be so. Everyone has always thought that refugee integration is best done if refugees are integrated in cities. But of course, congregate settings of any type are places that are high risk for the transmission of diseases. That said, the positive notes, I think, have to do in part with visa extensions and regularizations that were offered to some populations where it was made entirely clear that there was no way to go back home, and to the extent we're noticing shortages in the labor market and realizing that suddenly if you close your borders to immigrants and refugees, you have big problems with running your industry and services. So that realization, along with the fertility dimension that was mentioned earlier, might hopefully lead to policies that are welcoming at least to some categories of migrants and refugees. I'd love to hear more about the Portuguese regularization.
Yes, thank you. Well, about the challenges, I will just have to repeat what Katerina just said. It's exactly what's happening also in Europe. But regarding the Portuguese experience, I can go a little bit further. So, like many other countries, regarding the authorizations that and the visas that were not valid anymore, the government decided to automatically extend them until a given period. I think it's still ongoing, because there was no way that they could go and address the public authority to renew, and there was no administrative services open back then. And now the ones who are open are still functioning, not 100%. So all the authorizations that were valid were automatically extended, and they are still valid. For any, and if it's required for any other act within the country, if it's needed to open an account, a bank account, to switch services of electricity, whatever, it is considered valid. So in this regard, the Portuguese government protected the citizens that were legally staying in the country. Regarding the other citizens who don't have the situation regular situation within the country, but had a pending application for a residence permit. The objective was to protect them. These are the persons who are more in danger. They don't have any kind of protection, and access to certain, not to the basic public health that is granted to everybody who is in the territory, regardless the status, but access to more in-depth public service and public health care, it's dependent on having a legal status. And what the government decided was to grant this legal status in order to allow the access to the public health care to not only to the basic one, but to the more developed healthcare that could be needed by these persons that didn't have the legal status back then. And this is still, of course, ongoing. Persons who had an application pending at the Portuguese authorities.
Thank you so much, Mario and Katerina. We're getting close to the end of time, so I would like to ask each of you to make a brief closing statement with some important key takeaways that you would like our audience members to get from your presentations, and then I'll hand it over to Duarte to close this out. On my end, it's been fascinating, and I have even more questions, but we must stick to the time. So Katerina, if you could give kind of a closing statement, that would be great.
Yes, let me make 2 points. One is that in the short term, in the first year a country hosts the refugees, there are significant costs, but in the medium term, and certainly in the long term, there are very significant economic benefits and certainly cultural benefits to hosting countries. So that's relatively clearly established. The other point I wanted to make is that sharing responsibility between countries is much discussed, if not practiced. What has not been extensively discussed and is worth emphasizing is sharing responsibility within countries. So when refugees come, not putting them all in a camp by the border and expecting those border communities to be extraordinarily generous, but making sure they have access to the mainland, making sure that they have access, ideally, to work opportunities and can become productive members of the community quickly, will also help radically reduce xenophobia and backlash against these policies.
Thank you. Mario?
Thank you. Well, from my side, I will not speak on behalf of Portugal. You know our policy. We are quite generous, but from the EU perspective, I would say that it's a work in progress. It's still in progress, and we hope we will not end up stalled again like we were in 2019. I see, or I think everyone who is following the discussions here, we can see some developments. Of course, mainly in the external dimension, but also in the internal dimension, we think we are able to do some improvements, some steps forward regarding legal migration. You know that in the asylum policy, it's much more complicated. It lies on regulations that apply throughout the EU, and it needs this qualified majority, which is very hard to achieve. But we also assist, and I'm also following the discussions at technical level, the willingness of the member states to look for creative solutions. The Commission already presented a set of proposals to deal with this solidarity principle and to have a solution regarding the distribution of the burden that the frontline member states face. But member states have been able to work on these proposals to further development, and hopefully we will continue working and discussing with each other, and we'll find a way through. I'm quite positive about it.
Thank you, Mario. Duarte?
So I just would like to thank you all for being part of this very interesting discussion. Thanking our special guests, Dr. Katerina Linos and Dr. Mário Pedro, ACASEMI as well. And on behalf of the Institute of European Studies and on behalf of the Center for Portuguese Studies, once again, thank you so much. And we wait you guys in the next meeting, which will be of this series called Bridging the West Coast's European Union in Berkeley. And it'll be on November 15. It's going to be about the total different issue. Subject is going to be about digital agenda. And but I wait you, and I'll thank you once again for being part of this event, and have a nice day.
Thank you all.